want to say that I'm inspired by the fact that he never got a formal education, but he was respected. Lately, we seem not to be able to explore our, what do you call it? Explore the what we were born with. We all want to go to the mainstream education and forget that we are also human beings and there are other ways of exploring and proving that people were born to be leaders. I think I'll pause there.
Yeah, thank you for that. Really, really true. And actually at this time, I'm going to hand back to Colin to perhaps respond to that and then move on into the Q&A.
Yeah, so I think that's true. Very well said. I think he's, although he had a lot of arrogance, he was also very humble. But he was assured. I'd like to take issue there with what you're saying, Nigel. I don't think he was in any way, in any shape, felt to be inferior to Du Bois or those tertiary educated people. He had a certain kind of West Indian arrogance, actually. I mean, if you think about what was going on, as I said, whenever a West Indian got 5 or 10 cents above poverty, started a business, I think there was jealousy because the West Indians did better. If you, I mean, without wanting to call names, if you were just to think about all the Caribbean people who would lead African-American studies or African-American professors in America today, a lot of them come from the Caribbean. And I think there was a sense that although they'd had terrible privation and they'd had to withstand enslavement, they weren't as beaten as some of the African-Americans that they confronted. And so a contemporary of Garvey's was Claude Mackay, this great poet. And around about the same time, 1919, he was a porter, Pullman porter on trains, going up and down America, sometimes crossing the Mason-Dixon line. And often there'd be moments where they'd be rounded up, the porters in the barracks, or even if they went to a bar, they'd all be rounded up and in a dragnet and brought before the courts. And as soon as the judge heard the African Americans, they'd get harsh sentences. But when the lyrical Caribbean poet spoke, the judge was enthralled. Caribbean people felt more highly, they were more highly regarded than some of these African Americans. And I think that that spirit of resistance was writ large in Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey wasn't as poetic as Mackay, but he believed in the sentiments of, if we must die, with our backs to the wall, we'll fight. And I think that there's no way, Nigel, that he would have felt inferior to Du Bois.
Well, I'm happy to stand corrected. I'm happy about that.
No.
Thank you for that.
He could hold his ground with any person. I mean, the problem that Garvey had was that he recognized that, but sometimes he couldn't moderate his voice. So often he thought he was speaking to a huge audience. And it became problematic when he was arrested and was put on trial, because Garvey, being this great orator, being this uber intelligent man, dispensed with the services of his lawyer. And it's often said,
he represented himself, yeah.
Yeah, but the man who represents himself as a fool for a client, because there's various shenanigans that goes on in court, which Garvey wasn't party to, but also he couldn't moderate his address. So he was talking to the jury as if he was talking to the crowds at Speaker's Corner in Harlem. And he was non-stop. So the trial should have gone on for about a couple of days, maybe a week. It went on for over a month. And the judge was pissed off. And that, I'm sure, contributed to the sentence that he got thereafter. because he didn't recognize that there was anybody who's going to be better than him. Could be the judge, could be the president. He was the measure of any man, and that included W.E.B. Du Bois, I think. Yeah. See, I think I got very animated by this, Nigel, because I was always affronted by the reverence given towards Du Bois. I mean, Du Bois is great. Don't get me wrong; he's great, and I think with the passage of time, he recognized that he and Garvey should have been on the same side. They were singing from the same hymn sheet, but Garvey's was sort of printed on the street corner, whereas Du Bois is embossed somewhere in some sort of high production values. But ultimately, I mean, Du Bois didn't fare very well when it came to the authorities. As we all know, he ended up in Ghana. And when Nkrumah talked about the difference between the two, Du Bois and Garvey, he revered Du Bois for his intellectualism, but he said Garvey was the source. That's Nkrumah. Garvey is the source. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as a fellow Jamaican, listen, I stand down wholeheartedly and actually draw comfort from that fact. So I'm going to hand back to Akaita to moderate our Q&A. We've got about 25 minutes until 8:45. We're going to finish today. So please get your questions ready in quick. And please, host, back to you.
Okay, so yes, so as Nigel just said, we've got some time for your questions and answers. I'm just going to give you a chance to connect with Colin and field your questions or discuss some of the points that have been made so far. So the way that we do this, for those who are with us for the first time, is that we ask you to raise your virtual hand, come on camera and off mute when you're called, and then talk to Colin directly. As we say every week, I'm trusting you to keep the questions nice, brief, and succinct. If you would prefer me to ask any questions on your behalf and you prefer to stay off camera or on mute, I'm happy to do that, and I'll be monitoring the chat as well. Okay, so Colin, just to let you know as well, we take questions in groups of about 3 to start with, so it might be a good idea if you want to note them down as they come. So I'm just going to have a look to see if anyone has their hand up, and then I will ask you to come off mute. So is it Nabantu, do you have a question? Do you want to come off mute? Nabantu?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's my first time on the session today. I actually bought the book a week ago, and suddenly all these notifications started coming through on my social media with regard to this group. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm sure you can hear in my voice. But anyway, just to give you some background before my question. So I'm a 41-year-old first-year student in international relations at the University of South Africa. So I reside in the Northwest region of South Africa. Lerato there is my neighbor. We don't know each other, but she's my neighbor. She's a fellow country lady. So I'd like to thank you all very much for the informative session, especially you, Dr. Grant, with what you shared today. I think I'll make one comment, and I'd like to ask a question. So my comment is the fact that I would love to understand, as I grow in terms of the thought system of Pan-Africanism, also understanding the human beings, you know, and what their essence was, because I have a business that I've been operating, and I also had to educate myself and, you know, take myself up from the bottom right to the top, and oftentimes back down again. And I think for me, the concept of imposter syndrome in my own personal experience is something that is real, because at some point I found myself watching the back door as opposed to progressing and moving forward. So in terms of Marcus Garvey's story, I can almost relate in a sense that at times, because you're just not aware or not in tune with certain concepts, you find yourself focused so much on moving forward that you forget to actually close the back door, and you don't realize the wolf packs in a way that are coming for you. And I think if I were to put my personal experience, definitely there was, or there has been, an element of imposter syndrome throughout my journey in life and in business, having not had the opportunity to pursue a formal education earlier on in my life. So that would be my comment on that. And then in terms of my question, I have two beautiful children.
Has to be snappy, Bantu. Has to be snappy.
Okay, I'm almost done. I've got a 15-year-old daughter, and in the world that we live in and all the transformation and the digitization that is happening around us, how do we inculcate, how would I, as an individual, as a mother, start to promote the thinking system of Pan-Africanism, especially to the generation that comes in afterwards or after us? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So is there anyone else that has a question? We are going to do this in groups. So if anyone else has a question, you want to put your hand up now. Otherwise, I'll just ask Colin to respond to that question and comment. Okay, perhaps Colin, if you want to respond to that for now, I'll see if anyone else puts their hand up in the meantime.
Yes, thank you, Bantu, and I appreciate your comment as well. And I think that's something that we all fear, this notion of being imposters. But I think that we must, where we can, turn it around. I mean, I worked for more than 25 years in the BBC and as a producer in the BBC. And from day one, I was considered to be an imposter because there was no one like me in the BBC. When I went to the World Service newsroom, it was very white. And so I didn't belong, I didn't fit in as far as they were concerned. And sometimes you can embrace that notion because it's writ large in the very structure in which you find yourself. So whilst I share and understand that view, I think it must be resisted because the feeling comes from other people more so than from yourself. And when I joined the BBC World Service, it was like everybody else in the newsroom were like in London, in Britain where we live, we have these high-end cabs called the black cabs, and you have to spend years getting a license, and they're very expensive to drive these cars and to get into them. And then in South London, you can get into a mini cab with an unlicensed driver. And when I joined the BBC, it was as if I was joining the black cab official organization, but they considered me to be a South London minicab driver with no license. So I think we must challenge that also. With regards to the digital world in which we live, it's very difficult, isn't it? But I think we need to encourage people to slow down. That includes our children. And you need to just sit with them. And eventually they will come to you. It may not be speedy or sudden or as fast as you want, because there's so many distractions for children. I've got 3 children myself. And even when I was writing this book, even when I was researching this book, which took me 3 years and almost broke my marriage because I was more in love with Garvey, it seemed, to my wife than I was with her. I was in love with rescuing Garvey from the terrible books and notions about him that were being promulgated by his enemies. But I would be spending hours up in my study researching Garvey, researching all the minutiae of his life and all the enemies that were at the gates trying to do him harm. And I'd come down to dinner, be very excited, and I'd be talking nonstop. And my children would interrupt me and say, Dad, Dad, nobody cares. Nobody cares. And that went on for a while. But I kid you not, the greatest consumers of my books today are my children. And I think that we mustn't legislate for their children following the path that we think that society is leading them down, or that they seem to be going down because that's what's been reported all the time. Eventually, I think, with a little bit of just standing still and showing what you can, hopefully your children will come to see that there is an alternative to the mad dash towards conformism in which they are often driven down. So all power to you, Bantu, and all power to you for being able to climb through your difficulties up to the top and down again and up to the top. And that's the Garvey way, I would say. And what I love about Garvey and what I love about the tale that you've told is that there is always hope. And what Garvey did, I think, was show that you can bounce back. And that's the greatest thing about Garvey, actually. I mean, he had so many failures, but he just pulled up the collar of his coat and he walked on. And I think that's what we must do, and we must show our children that. I mean, the great thing that Nigel will recognize also, and I wonder whether it's true in South Africa, is the walk. The walk, we say in Jamaica, walk good. Well, I mean, we have these little phrases that I was been told as a child, and which you don't necessarily understand at the time, but with the passage of time, you do understand. I mean, my father, a very working class Jamaican man who worked on a production line all his life, building Vauxhall Motors cars, he had a very fine walk. He walked just faster than slow. He was never going to run. And when I think about him now, and I think about his walk, it was like he was permanently on the losing side of the FA Cup final, mounting the steps to collect his loser's condolence medal. But there's always dignity in defeat and the possibility that triumph will come. So triumph will come for your children, I'm sure. It's coming their way. Things are changing.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Colin. We've got Freddie with his hand up, if you want to come off mute.
Thank you very much, Colin. Thanks for, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Thanks for a great presentation, very insightful. And I appreciate the sentiment that as most Black leaders of his age, he was under attack on multiple levels.
Yes.
So my question is really, were there any allies that were kind of coming to him or trying to kind of aid him in his endeavors in terms of, you know, if you look around the diaspora, you've got a contingent in Africa. Obviously, that's the biggest bloc, but you've also got the Brazilian bloc, you've got the Haitian bloc, you've also got the bloc in Europe. Were any of those forces looking to kind of ally with Marcus and actually kind of build him up and give him some kind of support?
Thanks, Freddie. Yes, there were. I mean, there are many, many chapters around the world.
I'm sorry, Colin, I was on mute. I'm just going to group the questions because we have another one, if that's all right.
Okay.
So Baba's got his hand up as well, if you want to come off mute.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, my apologies. I was unavoidably late for the meeting and missed the first hour. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that there'll be recordings later. But anyway, I met Colin responding to Nigel on Dubois and Marcus Garvey, and it took my mind back to like my radicalization. Garvey played a key role, but it was not just that. I remember in high school then, as where it was either you were with Garvey or you were with Dubois, just as you were either with Michael Jackson, rooting for Michael Jackson, or Shalamas Jeffrey Daniels. I was for Jeffrey Daniels, I was for Marcus Garvey. So I would play devil's advocate here, and two questions. One, my apologies if this has been addressed already by Colin, as I pointed out, I was a bit late. The question of Garvey having not necessarily a relationship, but tenuously shared views with the KKK being on the right in terms of also standing for separatism, you know. So for me, that was something I never fully got my head around. I mean, even if the devil was thinking right, I would still stone the devil. You know what I'm saying? I mean, so then the second, what is the state of the United Negro Improvement Association at the moment? Because part of the issue of the legacies that our leaders gone by leave. I mean, whatever we might say about Dubois, and I mean, you have the NAACP being something that has not only outlived him, but has continued in different places, in different ways to play roles, including the civil rights movement, and even to some extent now. So thank you. I'll appreciate your responses to this, Colin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, and we've also got, thank you, Barbara. We've got Whitney with her hand up as well. If you'd like to come off mute.
Hi, thanks. Thank you so much, Colin, for your work. Appreciate it. So I'm a psychotherapist, so I always have a bias of what was, his mental health like? What was his psychology like? So you spoke a lot about how he bounced back a lot of times. He had to. And he experienced a lot of betrayal, failures, attacks on multiple levels. So did you get the sense maybe later on, he had symptoms of depression or anxiety or hopelessness, loneliness? So I'd really love to kind of hear your angle on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Colin. So if you want to go with those 3 questions, because we've got about 10 minutes left.
Well, they're all great questions. And I'll take them in the order in which they were given. So with regards to the allies, yes, Garvey had many allies around the world. There were thousands of chapters, thousands of different organizations that were allied to him. And these chapters were dispersed throughout America and Africa. There were chapters in South Africa that we know of, and obviously in the Caribbean, in the English-speaking Caribbean and the Spanish and the French Caribbean. And he was very keen when there were any kind of delegates to any of these conferences which he held, he would seek and solicit delegates from around the world, but especially from Africa and from the Caribbean, no matter whether it's English or French or Spanish speaking. And he spent time in Costa Rica, he spent time in Panama. And so he recognized that there was unity to be had across Black countries or Black populations, no matter what language they spoke. Even in America, and even in New York, there were allies amongst organizations like the African Black Brotherhood. There were allies amongst the magazine editors of The Messenger. There were even allies to be had amongst the communists. But they were all fighting for their own share of the supporters. And sometimes that led to conflict, jealousies. And especially the communists were just incensed that here you had this huge numbers of working class Black people who could be wielded and wedded together under this idea of class first. And there was Garvey saying, no, race first, class second. But equally, some of the potential allies were rather put off by his arrogance and his bombastic nature. They were put off by some of his tactics. And they quite quickly saw that the ships were failing and they'd made bad investments. So there were allies to be had, but they soon became enemies. And some of these people, quite shockingly, like Cyril Briggs, they even gave evidence against Garvey when he was brought to court. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. So one of the biggest mistakes Garvey made strategically was to go and meet the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, I think it was in Atlanta. Now this is a time in the early 1920s when Garvey recognized that a lot of his agents working in the South were being beaten up, sometimes were being shot and killed, were having a really rough time. This is also a time in America when people were still being lynched. I mean, Black soldiers came back from the First World War and in their uniform were lynched, especially in the South. And Garvey was, like many people, mystified as to how this could go on. This was not just the isolated cases, tens, 20s, hundreds sometimes in a year of people being lynched. And Garvey thought to himself that there's no way this can be countenanced unless the authorities are in league with the Ku Klux Klan. So when Garvey went to meet the imperial wizard or his assistant, he thought he was meeting the heads of government. He thought they were the real authorities and that he was going to sue for peace with them make a strategic alliance to say, okay, KKK, stop molesting our people, stop encouraging people to attack them, sometimes to lynch them. Make a pact with us, help us with our great desire to leave the United States and go to Africa. So that was the strategic decision he made. Unfortunately, as I said before, a lot of Black Americans, for them, their home was America. There was no way. And to climb into bed with the very people who've killed you, who've killed your neighbors, who've killed your children, who've killed your fathers and killed your husbands, that was a great betrayal. And that's led to the great campaign, which was called Garvey Must Go. The real trickle of dissenters became this huge flood of people who thought he was discredited. Now, with regards to his mental health, I mean, I think he had great resilience. I mean, Whitney, you all know that this notion that the more stress you expose yourself to, possibly the stronger you become. I mean, there's a guy called Emerson Fittipaldi, this great racing car driver, Brazilian, who talked about the fact that the more crashes he had, the safer he felt, because he knew where all the risks came from, where the jeopardy was. And certainly Garvey had his fair share of jeopardy. But I think what's not really been investigated is how he kept sane. I think he kept sane because he had a great rock bed of people who supported him, mostly women. I mean, even the wife that he spurned, Amy Ashwood, was by his side by the end, and Amy Jakes too. But a whole raft of women supported him. There'd be no Garvey without that. But yeah, I don't really know, because again, we sometimes struggle, I think, to put our modern minds in the minds of someone who lived 100 years ago. And they had a different mindset. I mean, there was no psychiatrist for Garvey to go to. There were no psychotherapists. There was no analysis. I remember talking to a doctor in Nigeria who wrote an article for Granta just 10 years ago. He said there's no mental health issues in Nigeria because there are no doctors to treat those mental health conditions. I mean, that's not true, of course, but the suggestion that the illness can only be made manifest if there's a possibility for a cure is what I'm saying. And if Garvey did suffer, and I'm sure he did, from huge assaults on his mental health, he battened down. He knuckled down, and he wasn't a great one for articulating his woes. He was a great optimist, sometimes foolishly optimistic, but that great optimism, I think, fundamentally enabled him to get out of bed and continue as he did for many, many years. I mean, it's a shame he died at 52, and I'm sure that his ill health was in part the result of all the stresses that he'd been under for so many years. Thank you for that, Whitney.